The role of the government in cybersecurity. That's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to Threat Talks. My name is Liewe Jan Koning, and here from the headquarters of On2It in the Netherlands, we bring you Threat Talks. Let's get on to it.
Welcome to Threat Talks. Let's delve deep into the dynamic world of cybersecurity.
Today we have a returning guest. I'm really thrilled to have you back again. David Haig, welcome.
Oh, it's awesome to be back and great to be in the Netherlands live too.
Last time we had quite a distance between us, but today we're actually here in 3D in real life. So looking forward to today.
It's so great to be IRL.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So you helped create the ONCD. That's the Office of the National Cyber Defense, the National Cyber Director.
Yeah, that's right. And, kudos to you for getting any acronym right in the U.S. government. We make up acronyms in cybersecurity all the time, and mostly we forget what they mean. So that was very good.
Yeah, well, you have the LVA for this, the list of abbreviations. That just come in handy. But when you were at Capitol Hill, you helped create this office, of course. So you know a lot about that and about its history, because it's been a couple of years. We're going to talk about that, of course. You're now an advisor. There's nothing you cannot answer probably in cybersecurity. You're knowledgeable about policy, about government policy, about compliance, about insurance and all that. We did a great episode of Threat Talks earlier on ransomware and on insurance, etc. Is there anything you cannot talk about?
There's a lot I can't talk about, mostly about the aliens. Oh, wait, cut that. No. Although I will say, when I was working on installing my own home network security and I installed my Palo Alto 200 and my wife couldn't watch Netflix for a week, that was probably the lowest point of our marriage. So there are some topics in security of which you probably shouldn't ask me to actually manage your network.
Well, let's stick to government policy then for today, or shall we? You helped write a report that we're going to talk about. Can you briefly introduce that?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in around the 2009-2010 time period on Capitol Hill, I worked for a member of Congress, Jim Langevin from Rhode Island. And he was one of the first members of Congress to really take on cybersecurity policy and help put forward legislation that looked at who owned what responsibility in cybersecurity. You've got what the military is doing, you have defending federal networks, you have law enforcement and private sector. It's really complex. And so he put forward a bill that codified this position in the White House. They would run air traffic control on that. And that bill ended up being the Office of the National Cyber Director, which was put forward and has been operational throughout the Biden administration. And at the end of the administration, the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law just put out a report saying, hey, what's worked? What could have improvement? And then, where do we need to focus as a new administration comes in? And they're going to have a chance to help rearrange some of the chairs and think about what direction it should take.
So today is the day to talk about this, of course. There's opportunity to evaluate what went well, what went wrong, and what should be better then. Shall we focus first on the past administration? The Biden administration was there. What worked?
Yeah, well, coming from the Obama administration and not having been in the Biden administration, it's great where I get to be on the outside now, judging my friends and colleagues. But, I think there were a lot of things, challenges that they were faced with. If you look at not just, of course, the global pandemic, but the pandemic's effect on enterprises where everyone shifted to a work from home standpoint, led to a dramatic increase in cybercrime, especially ransomware. Coming from the cyber insurance industry, we saw that financial hit and watched it, and it was devastating for many industries. And actually, one of the stronger things that I think this administration did that, back in the Obama administration, that we hadn't had a big focus was on cybercrime. Mm-hmm. So we had really been focused on larger national level threats or, how do we counter state-to-state espionage, and
during the Obama
administration, that's okay. Right. And the Biden administration, came up after, some insistence in working with the private sector that said we really need government resources to start really focusing on these criminals, not just from a law enforcement standpoint, from a broader policy standpoint. to take that on. And they launched an initiative, a multinational initiative called the Counter Ransomware Initiative. And that effort getting kicked off has been one of the first large international counter cybercrime efforts that was really led.
Yeah, so that there's a shift then from more nation state or evil countries kind of approach, in my words, towards more cybersecurity in general, where of course there's the criminals that play a big role as well.
Yeah, and I don't even know if a shift, because it's certainly, especially with the invasion of Ukraine and sort of the rise in a lot of large transnational threats, that has been a key focus. And now, of course, coming up on Christmas, everybody is still working, but burning the candle at both ends, trying to deal with Salt Typhoon. Including the ransomware actors, and you saw the FBI be able to claw back some of the payment from Colonial Pipeline, having some of the extra work that CISA has done around helping understand ransomware groups and what tactics and infrastructure they were using has really been critical, I think, from the private sector side to not only raising awareness of this threat, but how to make your organization resilient to it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Salt Tycoon. That's to those who have not heard about it. Could you explain how massive this was? What it was?
Yeah.
Or is actually
is and probably will still be a problem for a while if you follow the news on it. So a nation state adversary has reportedly gained access to a number of U.S. telecoms and had been targeting not just the political campaigns, but also apparently larger or more prominent political figures in the United States. And it's actually led to some pretty unprecedented warnings from the government. The FBI put out a release warning customers from using unsecured SMS. So public security announcement, switch to an encrypted messaging platform, right? Especially if you have friends that are on different phone types than you, or good international friends, which has always been good hygiene. But it's pretty, it was pretty unprecedented, I think, for the government to come out and say, we really need to think
don't use SMS.
Yeah,
that means that
SMS.
So what did as far as we know, those adversaries have access to then. They were in the heart of the telcos, US telcos, right? AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, those kind of companies.
So we really just have reporting, right? We're not exactly sure what specifically has been accessed, but the reporting has indicated that adversaries have access to, sort of the timestamp, who's called who, when, and then also potentially any of the content that's flowed through on text messaging. And that alone, of course, is devastating from a counterintelligence viewpoint and thinking about conversations or sensitive meetings or who's coordinating with who. So it's I think considered one of the larger
even
breaches.
if you don't know the content of messages, it's already very valuable information, as you say.
Absolutely.
Who talks to whom, which lobby groups are talking to which politicians, what international contacts there are. That's crucially valuable to any government, I'd say, in your intel.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then they also say they are able, well, from what the advisories of the FBI are, we can read the text messages probably. So SMS is plain text.
Yeah, exactly.
But apparently, they are at least the fear is that they are in the heart of the networks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's the concern, and that it's actually the concern is that it's also several major telecoms as well too. So, it's not like an isolated incident where it's only a small segment where an adversary was looking at specific intelligence. It appears to have been, even if they were just interested in specific intelligence, appears to be a pretty broad-based capability and attack.
Yeah, and those networks were created like years ago when cybersecurity wasn't really a thing. I mean, maybe a firewall, but that's it. No policy, never, nowhere, right?
Yeah.
No requirements.
Yeah.
So chances are that this is built on, well, I wouldn't say like too old or too legacy or whatever, not necessarily, but let's say battle-tested equipment, which has been there for a long time, and not necessarily with security in mind. So it's probably also, go change all your equipment as a telco. Imagine you have to do that, because that's probably what's required to fix this.
Yeah. No, I think so, right? And I think that's been the challenge that's been reported, and that a lot of, even though the telcos are constantly updating their infrastructure, and this is a major investment that they put into managing, keeping everything running, you still have infrastructure which is legacy infrastructure and is almost more like OT infrastructure. Where if you think the logic behind OT infrastructure is always fails open, right? So if anything breaks, your power will still work. A lot of the telco
Availability
systems, right?
over security.
Availability over security. Very well put. Exactly. And so I think like a lot of these original telco networks, legacy systems did favor availability and access. And, as you're looking to update them or root out an adversary that is, unknown level of depth that they've got access to, you may need to replace that infrastructure.
Yeah. And until then, that will take years maybe. So until then, we got to assume that this kind of data is out there. But it's hard to stop communicating, of course. And although we can have like a WhatsApp encryption on or use Signal or whatever, more open source, more community, peer-to-peer kind of network, still you see who's talking to whom then, huh?
Yeah. Well, and I think with end-to-end encryption, right, that's less of a concern. Except for then, of course, if adversaries gain access to those platforms.
Yeah.
But I think for a long time, it's hard. Exactly. And we've thought about email security. We've thought about data encryption, especially at work. We all started to hear those messages or get that security training. And I think this is a good wake-up call to also understand that those same electronic devices, those same systems that you're using for work and that you think about securing at work, you should also start thinking about securing in your private life.
Is this also a part where the government has a role to play, you think?
Yeah.
I mean, we as a company, we can make policy and say, hey, these are the allowed apps on your systems. You can only read your email on these devices. That's what we all do. But my wife, for example, she doesn't really have a policy like that to adhere to.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of control it a little bit since I'm a nerd, but
she doesn't follow the policies, the cybersecurity policies you set down for your whole household.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's
so who
my experience as well. Yeah. So I'll give a shout out here to Jen Easterly and the work that CISA has done, because I think that when I was at Homeland Security, we didn't think about ourselves as public awareness. FEMA had a role to play in warning people after disasters and things like that. But, I think what the department has done under her leadership is to say, we have a role to inform, and we're the ones that should put out guidance and easily digestible guidance, even for personal use. And so CISA has come out with some good recommendations on this, on ransomware, on just securing your own private data and staying safe online. And definitely commend Jen Easterly for that direction.
And that's everything that's that you can influence with behavior for end users then.
Yeah, that's
like
right.
Anti-phishing stuff. But But do you think there's also a role for government to mandate a certain quality of systems to vendors, for example, phone vendors? I mean, we can teach everyone in the country every day that they shouldn't open email, but we all know it happens. Also, in highly regulated companies, people get phished, right? So it's not like it's not the silver bullet.
Yeah.
If anything is at all, of course, that's a different philosophical discussion, maybe. Should government also set requirements that my phone software has, or the amount of years that their security updates need to be available, for example, you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very interesting. And currently in the U.S., right, there are no product security, cybersecurity laws, right? There are best practices and guidelines and industry-based standards. So, in the U.S., for that to happen, there'd have to be a whole new regime around products and the cybersecurity standards of those products before that even happened. So, it would take a lot in the U.S. to implement those.
Yeah, but they exist for buildings, for example, or elevators. I mean, we all recognize that those are that.
Yeah. This was the big debate in the United States back when I was writing laws and such like that, was what was the government's role in mandating cybersecurity or minimum standards or setting risk, right? And, we decided as a country we were going to adopt a voluntary approach, a market-driven approach. We've seen the cyber insurance market stand up a little bit here, like driving the adoption of multi-factor authentication among enterprises which is standard.
Well, if you have to pay less for your insurance because you do a better job at securing stuff, that's a great incentive.
Totally makes sense, right? Large enterprises that themselves have regulations and need to follow, Sarbanes-Oxley, do SOX 2 audits, right? They've started pushing vendor requirements down on their suppliers and asking their suppliers to verify that they're doing certain protections. So I do think that in the United States, we do have several market forces that are driving better security. The Biden administration also looked at pushing some of these market forces forward. They used presidential authority in areas that were already regulated, like water and health, to say, you're reporting on all these things, you're going to also need to start reporting on cybersecurity. Now, these weren't done under law. They were done under executive order, which means that they can be they're reset essentially when a new administration comes in. So there's a lot of this type of effort that is going to be up to the next administration to consider, do we continue trying to incentivize market-based approaches, or what do we do here?
Yeah, okay. And these initiatives, these executive orders, were there in the past administration, or also that started in Obama's era already?
Yeah. So during the Obama era, we launched the first essentially public risk framework under the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the cybersecurity framework. It's a super creative name, right? But the CSF, as it's called now, has really become a foundational document for enterprises that are SMBs up to massive banks to think about how they're investing against this risk. So, we started this process of saying the government may not have the authority to direct, but we can certainly help advise and guide on what the market should do around cyber resilience and cyber protection.
Yeah, and in the past administration, have there been successful successful programs that deployed or anything? And for example, how is that work on when you decide on a federal level that a certain thing is a best practice or a law or an executive order? Then how does that trickle down? How effective is that? Is that easy to do?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of these things are relatively new. And, like I said, we'll have to see if they're continued on in the next administration. So judging the effectiveness is a little hard, right? But I do think that generally a lot of organizations now, especially when you look at some of the public reporting requirements around the SEC that are mandated, that are stronger than executive order. It's an SEC regulation which goes through a specific rulemaking process, right? So it's a little more firm and sticky than just an executive order. But the requirements around public companies to not only report on cyber incidents, but to show investors that they've developed a process to identify their risks and then manage it. And something so the investment community that are savvy and that want to see their investments protected from massive harm from a cyber attack and look and say, is this company taking it seriously or not? And so I think there has been some progress very specifically for larger enterprises. And I think, it'll be good to see if some of those requirements are carried down into the supply chain as well, too, as they have to serve these larger public companies.
Yeah. So supply chain has it been a focus of the past administration?
Supply chain has been a focus of the past administration. It's also been some of the areas with unfortunately, some of the worst attacks.
Yeah.
Of course.
I mean, last year we had so many threat talks about something, and there's always something with a supply chain. It's a difficult problem.
Yeah. I read somewhere that 40% of attacks observed over the past year have come from a third-party vendor, which is
also, not really. It's huge, but not really a surprise.
Not a surprise at all.
We use SaaS services. Right. We use third-party software all the time. I mean, of course, there's going to be some. Yeah. You mentioned transition to the next administration, Trump administration, and this report that we mentioned in the beginning of this thread talk also mentioned that there's 5 things in there. More or less an advice on how to proceed, and the time is now. Those policies need to be made. Yeah. What are those? Can you elaborate a little bit on those 5 items?
Yeah. So I had a chance to serve in like the proto version of this office before it became law, and a lot of the recommendations we're making now are still holding up. And I think it's really around defining its mission where we've seen it be most effective, which is around the public-facing role that it serves. I think when I was doing cyber policy back on the Hill, a lot of it was classified. A lot of it was trying to figure out what's our role, what are we seeing success in, what are we not succeeding in, and then how do we build structures that codify that in various agencies. We figured out a lot of that base level game now. And so now what we've looked at is say, okay, there's this office that's sort of helping air traffic control all these different missions and common equities, right? And where they've been most effective. One of the areas they've been incredibly effective is working on external facing relationships. So much of the government's role in cybersecurity, since it's not a regulatory approach, is based on influence, guidance, and helping share out information. So helping decide that. Cyber diplomacy, exactly. We have a cybersecurity ambassador, Ambassador Fick, right, who's had a great success. Helping coordinate that policy so they're all on the same page has really been a key role here. for
Can you
them.
give an example of what kind of things are discussed in cyber diplomacy?
Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between Europe and the United States. But as an example, there are bilateral, and it's probably with China and Russia as well, or with Africa. Or it's probably all over the place. Eh?
Yeah.
What's been talked about?
Yeah. Well, just last year there was a large meeting on the U.S. and EU on joint cybersecurity efforts, and when we were thinking about cybersecurity, it was very operational. So we'd see a threat that was hitting European companies. We'd call ENISA, or vice versa. They get a tip, and it was very tactical. Yeah. Now the joint statement.
I know an example. For example, the ASML, the big chip.
That's right.
They were in heavy attack, and the United States found out. And that, of course, and then there's collaboration. So that's like also like government level instant response.
Yeah, it's a high five, U.S. and EU, like up top.
Exactly.
Now though it's broadening out to we are making up rules and regulations and guidelines for how companies should report. For example, critical infrastructure entities, what they should be doing for resilience, planning against fighting cybercrime. So it's the planning, the public-private relationships, and then the government policies. And when we laid out this joint statement in 2023, those are the areas we decided to focus on with the EU. And it's interesting to see that cyber has always been important. It's always been the digital backbone for us, but we've just gotten more mature at understanding that it affects a lot of things in a non-technical manner. So we need to have those non-technical discussions too.
Mm-hmm. And does the dialogue that you have with other entities, I can mention they are completely different from country to country. Eh? Is there anything in the world, any country in the world that's really sophisticated in this area?
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned that there's interesting conversations going on, and I can't name the country specifically, but back in the 2010, 2011 time period, the United States had received some tipping that there was a cyber threat to a country whom was not an allied partner, was not even a friendly partner, but it was against their critical infrastructure. And, so we reached out directly, but it was a big decision about whether or not we say anything. When we reach out, what do we do? Because we had no rules, right? If it was like a terrorist attack, there are rules and guidelines and international law enforcement cooperations. If a bad guy is crossing a country's line, they don't like him and we don't like him, we'll grab him, right? But in cyber, there was nothing like that. And so we set the sort of the policy in the Obama administration that we're seeing something against civilian critical infrastructure, we're going to reach out and warn them. And it's actually hard to get a hold of them. We had to call a third-party country, say hey, who do you know there, right?
Common friend.
You do have a buddy there, and then and then we set up a call, and I got to be there with like our head of operations on the phone, and it was a very awkward call initially. They're like, "Why are you calling?" But it was two professionals, right? Like there was no politics involved. It was like, we're professional, we're seeing this. What does that mean for us? And the exchange happened. And I think that because we all operate on the internet and it's a global commons type resource, I'm hopeful that there are areas of cooperation, of course, espionage, everybody spies on everybody else, military, when it comes to blows, it becomes a battle space. But our economies, our social lives, everything is online now. And there's a degree to which that shared infrastructure provides common goals for cooperation. And so, I think going forward in cyber diplomacy, or this idea of cyber diplomacy, it would be great to see more emphasis on that, or we could work together to build a more stable and resilient internet.
Yeah, and there's lots to do in that area internationally. So I can imagine if you have all that framework laid out and agree upon with other countries.
Agreeing is hard.
Yeah.
Not to be naive.
Well, I live in Europe. I know all about
exactly. Fostering agreement.
Yeah, exactly. So 5 recommendations. One is about a clear mission for the ONCD, right?
Yeah. So you can also you can read the report online for
we'll put it in the show notes, by the way.
Excellent. It's a really good report. The center spent a long time on it. There's also a video of the panel that we hosted on it at our conference, Cyber Next. So definitely, if you want the Cliff Notes version, go check out the YouTube panel. But some of one of the more common striking recommendations was actually this idea to improve cooperation through sort of dual-hatted staff. And staffing and people was a big part of this report. So the National Security Council has a group of cyber folks focused on operational. How do you dual hat so that they coordinate better? The Chief Information Security Officer of the U.S. government sits in our Office Management and Budget, which are the people that control all the budget, essentially. And how does he dual hat into the policy realm? There are experts within agencies that are very, very good at their specific thing. How do we bring those experts up for shorter terms into this policy group? So a lot of the recommendations were about you have these talented people, but they're only sort of doing one job. How can you sometimes, how can you break those
It's
silos?
not necessarily more people, because you hear it everywhere, maybe
right.
also, but it's more the stuff, utilize what you already have.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that message is also important. You know, the next administration said they really want to look at government efficiency.
Yeah.
And having worked in the bureaucracy on the Hill, like, I hear it. Like, we could definitely be more efficient from the government side. But in cybersecurity, you know, we had to build a lot of special, essentially hiring authorities to be able to afford cybersecurity experts that wanted to leave their private sector job, take a salary cut, and then come into the government. We had to do a lot to stand up new roles and classifications where maybe job training certifications didn't exist, right, when we started to do this. And so as the new administration looks to make the government more efficient, one thing that I think we're all hoping to see is that they recognize that the government has been making real progress on getting cyber talent into the government. And we want to make sure that those are the people that we encourage to stay there, encourage to support this mission, because it was like moving heaven and earth to get these people into the government, and keeping them there, I think, should be a top priority.
And let's use their potential, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How did the government do this? How did the government pursue these professionals to take that pay cut?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, it's having worked on both sides in the national mission and the private sector. You know, you do miss in the private sector the rush that you get in public service. And I think in cybersecurity, all of us naturally have some of this defender mindset. Some of us have the attacker mindset, right?
Yeah.
Which is good too. But even the attacker mindsets, you're doing it for a reason, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's always a reason you want to make stuff better.
That's right.
And actually, that strikes me all the time in our industry.
Yeah.
That people want to do good somehow.
Yeah.
So I can imagine if you can do that at the government level.
Yeah. I read all the time, like on Reddit, how do I get into cybersecurity jobs? I hear it's really, really well paying. And then you read about,
Great
the burnout,
motivation.
you know? And it's like, the burnout comes from the people that get into this profession thinking that it's like so lucrative. If you really want to make money, go be a stockbroker. Like, if you want to have impact, like, you know, go try and defend
Or
this
invest
field.
in AI. Huh?
Or invest in
Today,
AI, yeah. Well, depends on the company. But
you just invest in all of them.
Just invest in all of them.
That's the plan. Yeah.
That's right. But on the government side, I think, you know, we've had this great mission, but it's been hard to hire these people. And so we started in the national security space, saying, hey, let's make some exceptions. Let's get some of these top talent in here to help us with the government. We did a lot of rotational assignments. The U.S. Digital Service, I worked with representatives inside the White House that had been tracking a specific threat from their private sector hats. And we got them cleared, and they came in and they worked with us on this private sector, from their private sector viewpoint, on this like nation state hack we were looking at. And so we've used a lot of these creative programs cobbled together to be able to access talent that has been traditionally grown up in the private sector. And I think as we think through, hey, you know, where can we make things more efficient? The cybersecurity talent pool is something that we should really protect.
Is the ONCD focused on defense only, or primarily?
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of when we looked at them and their role that they serve most effectively, it was on these higher policy level issues, which are, you know, how do we drive more market incentives for cybersecurity protection?
Yeah.
How do you convince, you know, federal agencies to invest in their security as sort of required by law? So it is a much more defensive type role. And traditionally, the National Security Council has been more what we call operational, you know, an operational like code for more DoD type activities.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I can imagine any government needs both.
Yeah. No, but I think coordinating between those two sides is critical, right? Because obviously, you know, what you're doing from the defensive side is, you know, should be informed about what you know from, you know, more of the operational side, right?
Yeah, and the operational side, well, knows very well how the digital enemy, if you will, tries to get to you. So it's great to have that insight, of course. So then, and that's part of what you mean. Have all the professionals work together in a good way.
Yeah, that's like your threat research team, right? Like you guys have these folks out there understanding the threat and then bringing that protection back.
I mean, our goal is to protect our customers from exfiltrations. That's the single thing. I mean, resilience. That's all. But we do have hackers and threat intel specialists that seek how it's done. I mean, know your enemy.
You gotta have those attackers, not just the soft-hearted defenders. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Then if that would be the case, we would lose. So we set a clear mission, right? We also said collaborate and use the talent there is. Any other advice that you would give the administration? One of the other areas too that we put in a lot of work into, but I don't think that the past administrations are quite cracked, is how do you work with innovators? The government is good at buying big things from people that are used to selling to the government, but getting into that procurement process can be a nightmare. And some of the things that this administration coming in has also said is that they want to bring in more talent from more innovative companies. And I think in cybersecurity, right, the game is all about, where is the adversary innovated and how do we out-innovate them back as defenders and how do we get inside their OODA loop? And so the cybersecurity industry naturally lends itself well to startups, to companies that invest highly in research and development, highly in innovation, right? Because we have that human-driven threat that's always going to be creative. And so, I think we're hopeful here that in cybersecurity, as they look for areas like where in the federal government really benefits from strong innovation, that they can look at our cyber defenses and say, there's some exciting technologies out there, but these companies have no idea how to sell the federal government. How do we pilot them in here? How do we help match them up with partners? The program like FedRAMP, for example, has been, I think, seen as a big success, cumbersome, hard to access, but manageable. And I think one of the major challenges that still remain that I hear from startups is, how do I identify a federal agency to partner with? How do I even get to talk to these people? How do I get access and to hear what their problems are and see if my solution is a fit? And I think this is an area where the next administration could really help make some progress. Yeah, and the incentive there obviously is there's so much innovation, and we need that innovation inside. I mean, it's like a rat race at an amazing pace. So you need those innovations. So if you, as a government, make it difficult to deal with you, then you will not benefit from it. Is that the whole?
You say, I'll go sell to that bank down the street. Like, I don't need to. I'm not going to.
Yeah, they are also highly regulated. But less.
Even then, banks are better than the federal government. Yeah.
Talent is what's the international component on that? I can imagine. So, for example, if you want to work in aerospace, you need to be, I believe, a U.S. citizen. For example, is that something that the government is also mandating about or thinking about a policy? I can imagine that it's many countries would like to be somewhere in the U.S. government to play with the way they defend themselves, right?
Yeah. Well, it's easier to do business with the U.S. government if you at least have a U.S. entity, right? That has U.S. people subject to U.S. laws, U.S. jurisdiction,
U.S. screening.
Yeah, U.S. screening, right? But I think one of the interesting things is that as we've seen markets like Europe become more and more important to any middle large size company. The regulations in Europe will also apply. We saw this with GDPR, where there was a huge rush in the U.S. to try and understand the law, building compliance in their marketing systems, right? And even companies that weren't yet in Europe, but thought maybe down the road that they might be in Europe, started investing in GDPR early on because they saw the investment need to make now. And when you look as Europe starts to move forward too on cybersecurity regulations or regulations on AI, as they have with the AI Act, you see a lot of U.S. companies also thinking, how do I think more internationally? How do I start structuring my compliance, my hiring, my personnel to be a little bit more international, which I think is good. I think like a lot of different countries see different threat actors and have different approaches. Even with the same technology, there's a lot of things that the U.S. can learn from Europe, Europe can learn from the U.S., and I think encouraging the industry to adopt more common regulations, even if they're localized specific.
Challenging. It's already challenging on a state level.
Totally.
On a federation level.
Totally.
Yeah, well, GDPR, you mentioned GDPR, that's from the perspective of Europe, quite successful, I would say, because, I mean, for Microsoft, for example, to offer service in their cloud, you might as well make them GDPR compatible, and it will not be a separate version for the rest of the world, right? So that actually is now world standard, maybe. Good
That's right.
subject for the diplomacy we talked about.
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah.
AI, not so much yet. Huh? I mean, I don't know if you tried Apple Intelligence right here, but it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. Although I just bought an iPhone for my wife for Christmas with the new AI standards in it, so I'll get to play with it soon enough. Also, I guess I should tell her not to listen to Threat Talk till after next week. But
No, well, you know how to kill Netflix. I'm sure
that's
you know how to
right.
kill,
I'll just block the Threat Talk. I'll block YouTube.
block YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, and then send her a notification after. Yeah. Anything else that you would recommend for the administration to do in terms of legislation?
Yeah. I think the last thing for the next administration is that as they look to look at examination funding levels at various things, there are long-term programs and that have been underway that have been funded in a bipartisan Congress and have been nonpartisan issues that work better with continued investment. So if they're looking to do a 1-year dip in some program, there are a lot of programs that could really break things, especially programs that are responsible for getting technology into the hands of federal agencies. So I think of a program like CDM, Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, run by Homeland Security. This has been continually funded. It's been a big, essentially bulk buy program to get software into the hands of a lot of federal agencies that maybe would have trouble buying it individually.
Long-term contracting in a way.
Exactly.
In my terms, yeah.
Exactly. And, from the cyber side, when you stop that investment and you've got a multi-year project you're working on, it doesn't just set you back 1 year. It pushes off the entire program and potentially knocks you off the ability to actually execute it at all. So, I know I'm the cyber guy saying don't mess up anything in cyber, but, really in this area that has been nonpartisan, and it was nonpartisan during the Obama administration, during the first Trump administration, during the Biden administration. I think all of us that are on both sides of the aisle are looking at this and hoping that we can continue to keep it nonpartisan because we've made a lot of progress.
Yeah, many things were bipartisan throughout those years with alternating governments.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's possible.
And better than bipartisan, nonpartisan. Not
exactly.
even political, right? Yeah. Everybody agrees that nobody wants a hostile nation state reading our text messages, right?
Well, that's probably easy to become friends over. Then.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, what's the role of Zero Trust in all of this? Of course, we had the executive order first, and we had the NSTAC report that was by the previous administration put into the world. I mean, it provided a lot of guidance to many government organizations, companies as well, of course.
This has been another area that, I think the Biden administration has made good progress on. We saw it first established in Trump administration as well, and the Obama administration talked about it a little bit. But also where agencies have been making massive investments, and we want to see them continue those investments because it's been working. DoD has a massive zero trust strategy for their very, very diverse infrastructure. They have a whole roadmap and plans and pilots. The Federal Policy Office at ONCD has been working to encourage agencies to buy this. CISA has been putting forward guidance and using CDM to deliver those capabilities. Right, it's been a lot of different players convinced to work together towards one strategy, and in the U.S. government, that is so rare to happen. It's so rare to happen over, even 1 year, much less multiple administrations.
Yeah.
And keeping progress going on that is going to be critical.
Okay. One last thing I wanted to briefly touch on. You mentioned the stuff that between the ENISA, the European version of the OECD, and the OECD. There were talks about that. So can you give us a little bit more information on what kind of things there were, or did they agree on anything at all, for example? What came out of that? Yeah,
so I don't, this was back in 2023, and there was a joint statement with the US and the EU, and it really expanded beyond the technical cooperation that we've seen into start talking about how do we work together on critical infrastructure, how do we work together on issues around cyber crime. And I think, where we have infrastructure, what's the international, would that be GPS, for example? So it'd be like
cables between the continents?
I think like around resiliency measures, like how are we working with our energy sector when we see a threat? How do we then, if we see a threat to the U.S. energy sector, how do we also ensure that gets telegraphed and delivered? If we're asking our companies to report on certain activities or incidents, how do we make sure that our partners and our allies in Europe are also asking for that, right? So it's like where we have common philosophical alignment and also coordinated defense, how can we match up our policies, not just the tactics, but the policies, so that we're both asking the same questions and then we're comparing notes so that we can be better operationally prepared.
Yeah, and make it easier for multinational companies to comply because the requests are the same.
Yeah, ideally, although the incident reporting requirements are still, still different. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in harmonizing reporting requirements. That's continued to be a challenge. Saying what can there be reciprocity, so that if I'm reporting in one jurisdiction, that's good enough for the other jurisdiction. It's really, really hard. Regulators don't like to let someone else regulate on their behalf, especially another country. Right. But, these are the areas that diplomats and policymakers hammer out, and they test here and they see if it works. And if it does work, then you can expand it. So, I think we're hopeful that cybersecurity will continue to grow together where we see common alignment. Because there are countries where we have completely different views on cybersecurity. Like, we see cybersecurity and privacy as two separate issues, right? Security helps protect privacy. But citizens have a right to privacy. And in other countries, they'll see cybersecurity technology as a way to gain access to the privacy of their citizens, right?
Yeah.
And like full packet inspection for firewalls, right, can also be used to read traffic coming through. And if you're reading the traffic for malware, that's cybersecurity. If you're reading the traffic for content, that's
Well, it all depends on how you use the data, of course. And
exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so areas where we do have philosophical alignments with partners like the EU, where can we work together to have better outcomes, easier for business, faster operational coordination, better strategy as we're facing adversaries? Because there are others in the world that we don't see eye to eye, and the diplomacy between us and them in cyberspace, there are areas we may just never agree, right?
Yeah. Do you think those bilateral, or is it bilateral between the United States and Europe, since that's the union as well? But does it go fast enough? For example, you can talk to Europe.
Yeah.
But what is Europe? In the end, it's the states that typically take a couple of years to have the legislation trickle down into the individual nation. So that can be a long shot. It's slow by nature, or maybe even by design. Huh?
Yeah. Although in some ways, it wasn't happening a couple of years ago. It was only happening in certain stovepipes. It wasn't happening in a coordinated manner, and now it is. So there has been progress at the government speed. That's light speed, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of cyber speed, it to your point, is very, very slow. And I think that the private sector, which has always had a leading role in cybersecurity, as we've been the innovators, as we've been defending our private infrastructure, is also having a lead role on international cooperation. As you have companies that are multinational that have to deal in both jurisdictions, and as you have cybersecurity companies like Ontoit that serve customers across these jurisdictional lines in the U.S. and the EU. And
we would love the same rules everywhere. Indeed.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
But what strikes me is that we've talked to several people last year. For example, Damen Shipyards, a large shipping company, and they say it's actually good that we have some regulation, because that also allows us to make decisions, and that's more like a weapon or so. Huh? So it's not like there's a government trying to control stuff and it's hard to push it through and to make rules or to make best practice or whatever. No, it's also the market that requests someone to take control.
Yeah.
And to the subject of what's the role of the government, well, maybe there's more than people would typically assume.
Yeah.
Is that the same in the US?
It is in certain sectors, right? I think you have certain sectors that realize their digital risk is tied to the success of their business, and they are looking for guidelines. How do I stay out of trouble with regulators? How do I avoid lawsuits from my customers? How do I implement things up to best practice according to intelligence that we have on nation states or bad guys? So they're looking for that role of the government to have some involvement in saying, what should we do? I think it gets more challenging when you go to smaller and organizations with less budget that are saying, well, I'm just going to really do what compliance requires. And if an audit isn't going to ask for it, I'm not going to buy it. And I still think that in our industry, and you had a great threat talk on compliance, but there is a large segment of our market that is compliance driven, right? And that compliance is also has some role to play too in that when you talk to especially vendor management. And it's like if you have vendors that have to, if maybe it's a payments vendor that has to implement PCI DSS, right? Like they have that standard implemented, which is a private sector standard, but they can at least show up the chain that they are at least doing these minimum requirements, right? And that builds some sort of trust in the community. So it has a role to play for sure. But at the end of the day, having an organization understand their risk is tied to their business is going to drive the smartest investment decisions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Davis. I'm afraid we're out of time already.
It's been wonderful. Thanks. I'm glad I could do this in person this time.
I fully agree. And let's see when next time you're here or when I'm in your place. We'll do the next episode of Threat Talks.
I'll see you in San Francisco.
Let's agree to that. Thank you very much. And to our viewers, thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope you liked what you saw today. If so, please like us because it helps us spread the word further. And while you're there in that section with buttons, press the subscribe button as well, because that will mean that next Tuesday you'll have the next episode in your inbox. From the headquarters here at Ontoit, goodbye. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Threat Talks, a podcast by Ontoit Cybersecurity and M6. Did you like what you heard? Do you want to learn more? Follow Threat Talks to stay up to date on the topic of cybersecurity.